They said I'd ruin the wedding photos, that I was too serious, too cold to fit their perfect picture, so they left me out of it. No invitation, no seat, no name. I told myself it didn't matter, until a month later, an email arrived. A $58,000 honeymoon booked in my name. My signature forged, my silence assumed. That was the moment I stopped being the daughter they could erase. My name is Claire Henderson, and this is how one canceled payment became my revenge, my freedom, and the truth my family never wanted seen. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. It was a cold April morning in my Cambridge apartment when the smell of coffee filled the room, the only sound coming from the slow drip of the machine. I scrolled through my phone, out of habit, half awake, half tired, until one photo stopped me. Emily's face filled the screen. Her and Jason standing under an arch of white roses, sunlight glowing around them like a halo. The caption read, "The best day of my life." Surrounded by love. Everyone was there. My parents, my cousins, even my father's business partners smiling like they belonged in a magazine spread. Everyone except me. The coffee cup trembled in my hand. A dark drop spilled onto the table, spreading in a slow, ugly ring. I couldn't look away from the image. My sister's wedding, the one I'd heard about through whispers and half-truths, had already happened, and somehow I wasn't surprised. A few weeks ago, when I'd asked my father about the invitation, he'd laughed lightly and said, "You're always busy with work, right? We didn't want to bother you." His tone was casual, like he was talking about the weather, not my sister's wedding. Then came the words that stuck like splinters in my chest. "You'd ruin the photo, Claire. You always look so tense, like you're in a board meeting instead of a family moment." I remember standing there, phone in hand, trying to process if he was joking. He wasn't. My father never joked about appearances. Later that night, my mother texted me, "Don't be upset, sweetheart. Your father just wants everything to be perfect. Perfect." That word had always meant one thing in our family. Polished surfaces, polite smiles, and anything unpleasant neatly hidden out of sight. Perfection didn't include imperfection, and I was the imperfection. I stared around my small apartment, the light gray walls, the stack of unread reports on the kitchen counter, the silence that stretched so far it started to hum. I'd worked for everything here, the rent, the furniture, the life. But in that moment, it all felt small compared to the house I'd grown up in, where I was now invisible. On the bookshelf sat an unopened envelope, ivory embossed with gold letters, the Hendersons. I'd found it weeks ago in my mother's car when she came to visit. It wasn't addressed to me, just another copy of the invitation, forgotten or discarded. I had taken it home, maybe out of masochism, maybe as proof. I reached for it now, the paper smooth and cold between my fingers. I slid my nail under the flap, tearing it open slowly. Inside the wedding invitation gleamed. Heavy cardstock, perfect calligraphy. "Emily Henderson and Jason McCarthy invite you to share in their joy." My name wasn't anywhere on it, but somehow it felt like it was written all over the margins, in the empty spaces where family should mean something. I held the card above the table for a moment before it slipped from my hand and fluttered to the floor. The envelope followed, crumpled and torn. I knelt down to pick it up, but stopped halfway. The sight of it, that perfect, meaningless invitation, made something inside me twist. For a long time, I just sat there on the floor, my knees drawn close, staring at the torn pieces. I thought about every family photo we'd taken over the years. Emily in the center, my parents smiling, and me on the edge, half out of frame. I'd always told myself it didn't matter, that work, independence, and success were enough. But looking at that picture on my phone, the one where I wasn't even invited to stand at the edge, it finally hit me. They didn't just forget me, they erased me. I got up, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, a fine rain had started, soft but relentless, blurring the streetlights into streaks of gold. A couple passed by, laughing under a shared umbrella. I watched them disappear into the fog. The rain tapped against the glass, steady and quiet. My reflection stared back. Same eyes, same tired expression, the same woman my father said didn't belong in the picture. Maybe he was right. Maybe their version of perfect needed to be spotless. No sharp edges, no reminders of the daughter who didn't smile the way they wanted, who didn't play along. I turned away from the window and picked up the torn invitation. The gold letters caught the dim light still shimmering despite the damage. I pressed the pieces together just for a moment, then let them fall apart again. They slipped from my hands and landed softly on the floor. A small, broken version of a family that no longer existed for me. The room smelled of cold coffee and rain. I sat back at the table, hands clasped, staring at nothing. Maybe they finally got what they wanted. A perfect photo, one without me. The hum of fluorescent lights filled my office as the cursor blinked on a spreadsheet I wasn't really seeing. My coworkers' voices drifted somewhere behind me, talking about deadlines, weekend plans, things that didn't matter. On my second monitor, columns of financial projections lined up perfectly symmetrical, logical. Numbers made sense. People never did. I'd spent years trying to be the daughter my parents could be proud of. Organized, driven, unshakable. Yet, every success I earned seemed to highlight the ways I didn't fit into their definition of family. I was always too much or not enough. Too serious, too focused, too different from the golden child they adored. Sometimes I think that dynamic started the moment I was born, when I was 10. Emily spilled orange juice all over the living room carpet. The bright stains spread fast across the white wool. She burst into tears, and my father swept her up, kissing her forehead. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said. "You're such a precious girl." 2 weeks later, I knocked over a bottle of black ink while working on a school art project. The spot barely showed on the rug, but my father's face hardened instantly. "Claire, can't you be more careful?" I remember standing there tiny and shaking while he rubbed at the mark that wouldn't disappear. That was my first lesson about stains. Some could be forgiven, others couldn't. Years later, when I got my acceptance letter to Wharton, I thought maybe this time would be different. I'd worked full-time while studying nights, sacrificed everything for that moment. I called my parents, voice trembling with excitement. My mother said, "That's wonderful, dear," my father added. "Just remember, higher degrees don't guarantee happiness." He never said he was proud, not once. The click of my mouse snapped me back to the present. My colleague Mark stopped by my desk, a paper coffee cup in hand. "Hey," he said carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. "You doing okay?" I looked up. Why wouldn't I be? He hesitated. "I heard your sister got married last weekend. Big family thing, right?" My chest tightened. "I wouldn't know," I said, eyes fixed on the screen. "I wasn't invited." "Oh." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's fine," I cut in, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Numbers don't lie, right? At least they don't forget to include me." Mark gave a small, awkward nod before retreating. The office noise returned, but everything felt hollow. When the clock hit 6, I shut down my computer and drove home through the soft drizzle that had followed me all week. My apartment smelled faintly of rain and old books. I kicked off my heels, dropped my bag on the counter, and walked to the shelf where the framed photos lived. Every picture told the same story. My parents beaming, Emily in the center glowing effortless. Me on the edge, half a smile, like someone who'd been added out of obligation. I picked up one. The 4 of us at Emily's high school graduation. She was valedictorian for her art program. I'd flown home from New York for the ceremony. I could still hear my father's voice that day. "Look at her, she's radiant. You should smile more like your sister." I'd smiled for the camera, then flown back that same night. I sat on the couch, opened my laptop, and started typing. The words came easily like water finding cracks in stone. They chose the light I wrote and left me in the dark. They built a family around appearance, not affection. And I've spent my whole life trying to earn a place that was never meant for me. The blinking cursor waited for more, but I stopped there. Some truths hurt more once they're written down. The phone rang, slicing through the quiet. My mother's name lit up the screen. I hesitated, then answered. "Claire, honey." She began, her voice tight. "Please, don't make a big deal about this." "About what?" "Being erased, your father is exhausted. He didn't mean to hurt you. You know how he gets when he's stressed. Mom, he told me I'd ruin the photo. That's not stress, that's cruelty. Sweetheart, he just wants to protect the family's image. The campaign's been hard on him." I let out a bitter laugh. "Protect the image, sure. As long as I stay out of the frame." "Claire, please don't. I have to go, Mom." Before she could answer, I hung up. The call ended with that small, merciless click that always felt heavier than it should. The silence returned, dense and suffocating. I looked around the room again. Everything neat, symmetrical, controlled. Just like the life I'd built to prove something to people who never noticed. My eyes fell on another frame on the side table, the family portrait from 5 years ago. We'd hired a professional photographer for my parents' anniversary. Emily wore a red dress glowing under soft lighting. My father's hand rested proudly on her shoulder. My mother leaned into him, smiling. I stood slightly behind them, angled awkwardly to fit. I picked it up, stared at it for a long moment, then walked to the trash bin. The silver frame felt heavier than it should. When it hit the bottom of the can, the sound was sharper than expected. Final. I leaned against the counter, breathing hard, hands trembling, but not from sadness, from release. Years of trying to belong compressed into a single metallic clang. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and watched the city lights flicker in the distance. Somewhere out there, my family was probably celebrating, pretending everything was perfect. But for the first time, I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't the daughter who tried to make them proud, or the one who stayed quiet to keep the peace. I was just me, flawed, unwanted, and finally done trying to fit into a picture that was never mine. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets shining like mirrors. I lifted the glass to my lips and whispered to the empty room. They haven't seen the last of me. The words surprised even me, but they felt right, like a truth I'd been carrying too long. And in the faint reflection on the glass, I caught my own eyes staring back. For once, I didn't look like someone on the outside. I looked like someone about to begin. The morning sunlight spilled across my desk, bouncing off the glass walls of the Boston office like a spotlight I didn't ask for. The city outside was already alive, horns blaring, coffee carts steaming. But inside, the quiet hum of air conditioning and keyboards filled the space. It was supposed to be another predictable Tuesday. I was halfway through sorting invoices when I saw it. The subject line glowed on my screen like a cruel joke. Congratulations, your honeymoon itinerary? Confirmed. For a second, I thought it was spam. My cursor hovered over the trash icon, but something, a tug in my gut, made me click instead. The email unfolded in neat corporate precision. Dear Ms. Claire Henderson, thank you for choosing Blue Horizon Luxury Travel. Your payment of $58,000 has been successfully processed. Attached, please find the itinerary for Emily and Jason McCarthy's honeymoon to Bora Bora. My breath caught. Beneath the text was an invoice with my name in bold right next to authorized signature Claire Henderson. My signature, perfectly forged, even the sharp upward flick on the H that only I ever did. My heart started pounding, blood rushing so fast it drowned out every sound around me. The screen blurred. I blinked hard, but the numbers stayed. $58,000. My sister's honeymoon, charged to me. I could almost hear my father's voice, calm, polished, practiced, telling me I was overreacting. I picked up my phone before I could think twice. He answered on the second ring. Claire, he said smoothly, as if he'd been expecting the call. You got the email, I see. My throat went dry. What the hell is this, Dad? He sighed. We wanted to surprise Emily. She's been through a lot planning the wedding, and this trip will mean the world to her. With my money. With my forged signature. Claire, don't be dramatic. His tone sharpened, slipping from polished charm to quiet authority. You make more in a year than most people do in 5. It's just money. Just money. I felt heat flood my face. You stole my identity, he chuckled softly. A sound that used to comfort me as a child, but now made my skin crawl. You're always so rigid about these things. Family helps family. That's what we do. Family doesn't forge signatures, Dad. That's fraud. Don't throw your legal jargon at me. I raised you. I made sure you had every opportunity. If anyone has earned the right to ask for help, it's me. That sentence. I raised you. Hit me like a slap, as if I were some lifelong investment he was cashing out. I couldn't speak. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Then his voice softened again, deliberate. Claire, don't make a scene. Emily will thank you once she finds out. You'll see. I ended the call before he could say another word. My hands were shaking. The phone clattered against the desk. A few heads turned in the open office, curious, but I forced a smile and muttered something about a bad client call. My chest burned. I grabbed my water bottle, stood up, and walked straight to the restroom. The mirror reflected someone I barely recognized. Pale eyes, wide, jaw tight. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water over my face, trying to wash away the disbelief, the betrayal, the humiliation that stuck to my skin like oil. I leaned on the sink, gripping the edge until my knuckles whitened. My father hadn't just crossed a line. He'd erased it entirely. By the time I returned to my desk, my inbox had exploded with notifications. One new email caught my eye. Bank alert. Account activity detected. I clicked it open. Transaction Blue Horizon. Luxury. Travel. Amount $58,000. Pending authorization verification. The timestamp was from the same morning. I stared at it, a cold clarity settling over me. The transaction hadn't fully cleared yet. It could still be stopped. I took a deep breath, forcing my heartbeat to slow. Then, without hesitation, I began taking screenshots. The email, the invoice, the transaction log. I sent copies to my personal account, naming the folder Evidence. A few minutes later, another notification popped up. Your father left a voicemail. I didn't listen. I didn't need to. I knew what he'd say. A lecture about loyalty, about gratitude, about how money should stay in the family. Instead, I focused on the screen. The numbers stared back unblinking. 10 years in finance had taught me one unshakable truth. Numbers never lie. People do. And in every lie, there's a trail. A timestamp, a signature, a payment path that leads straight to the truth. I printed the invoice and slipped it into a manila folder. Then I opened my planner. Drew a small red dot next to today's date and wrote 2 words in the margin. Find proof. I didn't know what the next step would be. A lawyer, the bank, maybe the police. But I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't about $58,000 anymore. It was about control. About years of manipulation and guilt dressed up as love. About my father treating me like an endless resource he could tap into whenever it suited him. I looked out the window. The skyline shimmered against the late morning sunglass towers, gleaming like they were made of trust. But I knew better. Trust could shatter in silence. Sometimes all it took was one forged signature. As I sat back down, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my mother. Please don't make this harder than it already is. Your father's under a lot of pressure. Just let it go. Let it go. I almost laughed. That phrase had been my family's motto for years. Every lie, every slight, every betrayal brushed aside in the name of keeping the peace. But there was no peace left to keep. I turned the phone face down, took one last screenshot, and whispered under my breath. You picked the wrong daughter to underestimate. The cursor blinked on the screen again, patient steady. I opened a new document and started typing, my voice steady in my head. Every number leaves a mark, and this time I was going to follow it all the way to the end. The office smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the kind of scent that made people trust it. Beacon Hill in the late afternoon glowed through the tall windows, the sun spilling gold over old brick, casting long slanted shadows on the floor. I sat across from Natalie Brooks, hands clasped around the paper cup she'd handed me, the warmth grounding me as my world tilted. She listened without interruption. I told her everything. The forged signature, the invoice, my father's voice dismissing it all like I'd imagined the crime. I expected skepticism, the polite disbelief most people wore when I mentioned my family. But Natalie's eyes didn't flinch. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. You know, she said, her voice low, husky from years of courtroom air and late nights. This isn't rare. Family financial fraud makes up over 15% of civil disputes in this country. 15%, I repeated, almost whispering. The number felt like a betrayal in itself. Proof that this kind of violation was common enough to have statistics. She nodded slowly. People like to believe family is sacred, but when money's involved, loyalty gets blurry. For a moment, the only sound was the soft click of her pen. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. You're not crazy, Claire. And you're not overreacting. I swallowed hard, a knot rising in my throat. You sound like you've seen this before. Her lips curved into a humorless smile. I have. My parents once took out a line of credit in my name when I was 22, said it was temporary. I forgave them. She paused, her gaze drifting to the framed diplomas on the wall. 2 years later, they did it again. That was the day I decided to go to law school. Her story hit something deep in me, a flicker of recognition of shared damage. It wasn't the same, but it was close enough that I could feel the echo of her old anger. What did you do? I asked quietly. I stopped making excuses for them, she said, and then I made sure they couldn't do it again. Natalie pushed aside her coffee mug and pulled a legal pad toward her. Here's what we're going to do. First, you contact your bank and freeze all major accounts. Every card, every linked savings, even your brokerage if they have access. I don't think they... She cut me off gently. Freeze it anyway. I've learned that "I don't think" is the most expensive sentence in the English language. A small, startled laugh escaped me. She smiled faintly, then continued. Next, you'll file a fraud report. We'll document the forgery and have the dealership confirm the signature discrepancy. Then I'll help you draft a formal statement for the bank's legal department. The goal isn't just reversal of charges. It's protection from future misuse. I nodded, taking notes on the yellow pad she'd slid toward me. My handwriting trembled slightly, but there was relief in the motion. Finally a plan. Something rational amid the chaos. Natalie's voice softened. You've been the responsible one your whole life, haven't you? The one who fixes what other people break. I looked up, startled. Is it that obvious? Only to people who used to be you, a silence settled between us. Not awkward, but heavy with understanding. I hadn't realized how much I needed someone to see me, really see me, until that moment. My phone vibrated on the desk, breaking the quiet. The screen flashed Mom. 7 missed calls. I exhaled shakily, staring at it. Natalie tilted her head. You want my advice? Please. Don't answer, she said simply. People who did nothing wrong don't call that many times in an hour. The phone buzzed again, relentless, and I flipped it face down. The vibration continued for a few seconds, then stopped, leaving a strange, echoing silence. Natalie leaned forward, her tone all business again. I'll email you a checklist by tonight. Steps to document everything, including screenshots and call logs. Keep every message, even the guilt trips. Especially the guilt trips. They're better evidence than confessions. I managed a small smile. You sound like someone who's been through this too many times. She shrugged, enough to know that blood doesn't make someone honest. When the meeting ended, the sun was already dipping behind the skyline. I gathered my things slowly, the manila folder of documents pressed tight to my chest. As I stepped outside, the chill of evening air hit me. Beacon Hill was wrapped in fog, the kind that blurred the edges of street lamps and made footsteps echo longer than they should. The cobblestones were slick, the world quiet, except for the distant clang of a trolley bell. I walked quickly, pulling my coat tighter. Each step felt heavier, as if my body hadn't caught up to what my mind already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a mistake. It was deliberate. Halfway across the square, I stopped and looked back. The windows of Natalie's office glowed warmly against the dusk, like a lighthouse for the shipwrecked. I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what my family had done, or of what I was about to do next. The phone buzzed again in my pocket, one final vibration that I ignored. Somewhere in that fog, my parents were probably spinning a story, trying to control the narrative before I could. They'd always been good at that. But this time, I wasn't the same daughter who stayed silent to keep the peace. As the mist thickened around me, I walked faster. The folder still clutched to my chest. For the first time in my life, I couldn't tell if I was afraid of them, or of the moment they realized I wasn't afraid anymore. The Henderson house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, gleaming porch light on the garden trimmed with military precision. It smelled faintly of pine and money. Standing in the driveway, I could almost convince myself I was just coming home for Sunday dinner. Almost. Inside the table was already set grilled salmon salad, red wine. The kind of carefully curated meal that photographed well. My father sat at the head of the table, phone face down beside his plate, posture perfect. My mother hovered nearby, smoothing invisible wrinkles from the tablecloth. Emily sat across from him, a vision of soft apology, in a silk blouse. Claire, my mother said with brittle warmth. You made it. I hung my coat over the chair. You invited me. Robert raised an eyebrow. You sound surprised. I am, I said, taking a seat. You usually prefer talking about me, not to me. He didn't react, just poured himself a glass of wine. Let's not make this dramatic. Too late, I said quietly. For a while, there was only the sound of silverware and the faint clinking of ice against glass. My father finally broke the silence. You've built quite a life for yourself, Claire. Senior analyst, 6-figure salary, the condo downtown. I'm proud of you. The words should have meant something, but they didn't. He leaned back in his chair. So tell me why you're making such a fuss over $58,000. You make that in what, 3-4 months? It's nothing. I stared at him the way a person might look at a stranger wearing a familiar face. It's not about the money. It's about respect. He set his fork down. Respect. You think I don't respect you. I think you respect what I can do for you. I said, my voice steady. But that's not the same thing. My mother reached for my hand across the table. Sweetheart, please. Your father only wanted to help Emily. She's been under so much pressure since the wedding. He didn't mean to hurt you. I pulled my hand back. Signing my name without permission isn't helping. It's fraud. Robert's face hardened. Watch your tone. Emily spoke then, her voice soft but trembling. I'm sorry, Claire. I didn't know. I never asked for that. I turned toward her. She looked genuinely upset. The guilt of someone who hadn't realized how much damage had been done in her name. I believe you, I said quietly. But you're not the one who forged my signature. My father's jaw tightened. Enough. This family doesn't need outside interference. We handle our business privately. Privately, I repeated. You mean quietly, so no one knows what you've done. He stood, napkin falling to the floor. This family exists because of my name, my work, my reputation. Everything we have is because of me. Then why steal from me to keep it? His voice dropped low, almost dangerous. Because family helps family. You've benefited from my name your entire life. Don't act like you're self-made. I felt something inside me snap. You're right, I said. You gave me your name, and you've been cashing it in ever since. Silence filled the room, heavy and sharp. My mother tried to smooth it over. Claire, please, let's not make this worse than it already is. I reached for my phone, opened my inbox, and turned the screen toward them. Do you see this payment pending confirmation? That's your idea of family values. A stolen signature, a lie to a bank, and a daughter you thought would never call you out. Robert's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me. Put that away. I didn't move. You talk about reputation like it's a shield, but it's made of glass, Dad. And you've been throwing stones. He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. You think you can threaten me? You have no idea what you're doing. I think I do. I said softly. You taught me. For a long moment we just stood there, two people bound by blood and broken trust. I could smell the wine on his breath, the sharp scent of expensive cologne that used to remind me of safety. Now it only smelled like arrogance. Emily shifted nervously in her seat. Dad, please, she whispered. My father straightened, smoothing his tie. You'll regret this, Claire. You're making a spectacle out of nothing. I slipped my phone into my purse and stood. I'm done being your nothing. My mother followed me into the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood. Claire, she called softly. Don't leave like this. Please don't make things worse. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. Worse. You erased me from your family photos, then stole from me to fund your fantasy of perfection. Tell me, Mom, how does it get worse than that? Her face crumpled, but she said nothing. Outside, the evening had turned cold. The air smelled like rain and pine and something else. Freedom, maybe. I walked down the steps, heels clicking against the stone, my pulse pounding in my ears. Behind me, the house glowed warm through the windows, all golden light and perfect shadows, the picture of a family that didn't exist. I stood by my car for a moment, staring at that false glow, the ghost of my reflection in the windshield. Then I got in, shut the door, and started the engine. As I drove away, the lights of the house faded in the mirror until they were nothing but small, distant sparks against the dark. The wind outside cut through the trees sharp and cold. They thought they'd taught me obedience. What they didn't realize was that they'd also taught me how to fight. Rain streaked down the window in thin silver lines, tracing paths through the reflection of my computer screen. Boston had that kind of rain that made everything feel quieter, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I was reviewing spreadsheets I couldn't focus on when a knock came at the glass wall of my office. My mother stood there holding a paper bag. She looked small, almost fragile, her beige coat damp at the shoulders. I hesitated before opening the door. "Mom, I brought you something," she said softly. The smell of warm apple pie drifted through the air as she stepped inside. I hadn't eaten that pie in years, not since college when she used to bake it for me before exams. I gestured toward the chair opposite my desk. "You didn't have to come all the way here." "I wanted to talk," she said, setting the bag on my desk. Hands trembling slightly. "Your father, he didn't mean for things to go this far. He's been under so much pressure with the campaign." I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed. "He forged my name, Mom, on a legal document. You call that pressure." Her eyes flicked toward the floor. He thought he was helping. He didn't want the press to find out that Emily and Jason couldn't afford the honeymoon. You know how appearances matter. Appearances. I repeated, tasting the word like it was bitter. Did you know he did it? She froze. The silence said everything. I felt my stomach twist. You did know. Her voice came out small. He told me afterward. I wanted to call you, but he said he'd handle it. I laughed once the sound sharp. Handle it. That's one way to describe covering up fraud. She winced at the word. Please, Claire. Don't use language like that. It makes everything sound worse than it is. It is worse than it is, I said quietly. You're just pretending it isn't. She reached across the desk and tried to take my hand. Honey, listen to me. Families make mistakes. But once you involve outsiders, there's no going back. This could destroy your father. I pulled my hand away. You mean it could destroy his image? Her eyes filled with tears. You don't understand what it's like. The things we've built. I cut her off. I understand perfectly. You're more afraid of losing him than losing me. That landed like a slap. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled low and distant. Finally, she whispered, This family needs to stay together, Claire. We need to protect our name. I stared at her, feeling the last thread of patience snap. You call that protecting the family? I call it enabling. Her chin trembled. Please don't do this. Don't drag us through the mud. I'm not dragging anyone, I said, my voice rising despite myself. You and Dad jumped in and started digging. She stood, slowly smoothing her coat with shaking hands. You're angry now, but one day you'll understand. I forced a steady breath. If understanding means becoming like you, then I hope I never do. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. She turned, pausing at the door. The pie's still warm, she said quietly. I made it the way you liked. I didn't answer. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the smell of cinnamon and regret hanging in the air. For a long time, I just sat there staring at the paper bag. Then I opened my laptop, scrolling through old emails. Somewhere near the bottom of my inbox, one subject line caught my eye. Final payment. The Henderson wedding venue. I clicked it open. There it was. A bill for $1,200 charged to my account 6 months earlier. The payment authorization field showed my name. Another forgery. Another lie. My throat tightened as I took a screenshot, saving it in a new folder titled Evidence. I added the Blue Horizon invoice, the bank alert, everything. Each file felt like a brick in a wall I was building between myself and the people who claimed to love me. By the time I finished, the office was nearly empty. Rain still tapped against the windows, steady, persistent. I stared at the pie across the desk. It looked perfect. Golden crust, sugared edges, still faintly warm. I pushed it aside. My phone buzzed. A text from Natalie. I'll file the report tomorrow morning. Are you ready for this? I stared at the screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was I? The word fraud still echoed in my mother's voice, softened into something less ugly, as if changing the name could erase the truth. Another flash of lightning brightened the skyline, followed by a long rumble of thunder. I looked out the window at the city blurred by rain and answered, yes. Do it. I placed my phone face down and leaned back in my chair. My reflection in the glass looked pale, but certain. Outside, thunder rolled again, louder this time, closer. I whispered to the empty office. They think I'll stay quiet like her. The rain fell harder, beating against the glass, but silence. I said almost to myself isn't an option anymore. The thunder answered deep and final, shaking the windows. I sat still, letting the sound wash over me, knowing that somewhere far away, another kind of storm was already on its way. The sun broke through my curtains like it had something to prove. For once, Boston wasn't drowning in rain or fog. The air was clean, sharp, the kind of morning that begged for clarity. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at my laptop screen. The email sat there, unchanged since last week. Blue Horizon, luxury travel, payment confirmation. My name glared back at me, the black letters cutting through the brightness of the screen. I scrolled slowly through the itinerary. 2 first-class tickets to Tahiti, a 5-star villa, oceanfront dinners, spa packages, even a private photographer. It was obscene. I could almost see my father smiling when he signed it, convincing himself it was justified. My finger hovered over my phone. For a second, I hesitated. Once I made the call, there would be no going back. I exhaled, then dialed. A robotic voice answered first, polite and soulless. "Thank you for calling Blue Horizon Luxury Travel. Please hold for the next available agent." Soft instrumental music filled my ear. I drummed my fingers against the desk, my pulse matching the rhythm. Then a real voice cut through the line. "Blue Horizon. This is Sarah Klein. How can I assist you today?" "Hi, Sarah," I said, forcing calm into my voice. "I need to cancel a booking under the name Emily Henderson. I'm listed as the payer on the account." "Certainly," she replied, typing in the background. "Let me pull that up." "All right, I see it here. Claire Henderson, you're the primary on the payment. May I ask why you're requesting a cancellation?" I stared at the screen. Because the payment was made without my authorization. My signature was forged. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that carried weight, forged. "Yes," I said firmly. "It's fraud. I didn't approve this transaction." She hesitated again. "The system shows full payment completed and non-refundable status. Are you sure you wish to proceed? Canceling will void the entire package immediately." "Yes," I said. "Cancel it." I never agreed to it. Another few seconds of silence followed by the soft clatter of typing. Then her voice came back measured, but sympathetic. "Understood. I'll file a fraud report and send confirmation to your registered email. Would you like me to include a reason for record purposes?" "Yes. Write this down. Fraudulent charge. Family member forged signature." "All right, Ms. Henderson," she said quietly. "I'm very sorry this happened. You'll receive an email within the hour confirming the reversal. If you need documentation for your bank, let me know. Thank you." I said, my throat tight. After we hung up, I sat there staring at the phone in my hand, the silence of the room pressing against me. Then the chime of a new email cut through the quiet. Subject: payment reversed. Blue Horizon Luxury Travel. Status: refund initiated due to reported fraud. It was done. The tension in my shoulders released all at once. I leaned back in the chair, head tipping against the window pane. Outside, the sun glared against glass buildings, the light almost blinding. For the first time in weeks, I felt lighter, free maybe, but my hands were still trembling. I took another sip of coffee, now bitter and cold, and closed my laptop. The peace lasted less than a minute before my phone started buzzing. First once, then again, then again. I turned it over and watched the notifications pile up. Genya home 12. Mom, cell 5 missed calls. I let it ring out, but the next vibration came almost immediately. A text, Robert Henderson. "What did you just do?" I didn't reply. Another came seconds later. Robert Henderson. "Your mother's crying. You're tearing this family apart. You'll regret this." I set the phone down, face down, and stood. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, from adrenaline, from the clarity of knowing that I'd finally done something he couldn't control. I went to the kitchen, opened a bottle of red wine, and poured a glass, even though it was barely 9 a.m. I turned on the speaker and let soft jazz fill the room. Miles Davis, slow and deliberate, every note landing exactly where it was meant to. I sat back at the window, sipping slowly, watching people rush down the street. Commuters with coffee cups, students with backpacks, a man walking his golden retriever. The world kept moving, unaware that my own had just split clean down the middle. The phone buzzed again. I didn't even look this time. Somewhere deep down, I'd thought maybe my father would understand. Not the fraud, not the deceit, but the boundary I was finally drawing. I'd hoped foolishly that seeing me stand up for myself might make him pause, but I'd forgotten one thing. People who need control don't stop when they lose it. They double down. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. The sun poured through the window, warm and blinding. For the first time, I wasn't the one hiding. The world outside sparkled, a postcard-perfect Boston morning. Blue sky, white clouds, a breeze fluttering through the trees. It should have felt like peace, but deep down I could sense something shifting. I'd pulled one thread, and the whole web was beginning to tremble. Somewhere in a pristine white house in Newton, I knew my father was pacing. my mother crying, Emily caught in the crossfire. And in that silence between Miles Davis notes, I could almost hear it. The faint rumble of something gathering force too far to see, but close enough to feel. The real storm hadn't hit yet, but I could feel the wind changing. 3 days later, when I walked into the office, I could feel it before I saw it. The hush that follows gossip. The silence that isn't really silent. People weren't meeting my eyes. I'd barely made it to my desk when Mark appeared, phone in hand, his face pale. "Claire," he said carefully. "You should see this." I took the phone. The screen glared too bright in the morning light. There she was, Emily, standing in her wedding dress, bouquet in hand, sunlight glowing around her like a halo. The caption read, "Betrayed by my own blood. Some wounds don't heal." Below it, a flood of comments scrolled endlessly. "I can't believe her sister did that. Who cancels their own family's honeymoon? Money makes people heartless." I felt something inside me tighten. Not rage, not sadness. Something colder. The kind of numbness that comes when you've already cried every tear. I handed the phone back. "Thanks, Mark." He hesitated. "Is it true?" I turned on my computer. Not the way she's telling it. When the screen came to life, my inbox was already overflowing. Dozens of unread messages. Reporters, old classmates, even relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. All of them wanted a comment. Buried among them was one from Natalie. "Don't respond. Everything's going the way it should. Let the evidence speak." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Let the evidence speak. Meanwhile, on another screen somewhere, Emily was speaking plenty. Her story had gone viral. She'd posted a follow-up, tears glistening as she spoke to the camera. I can't believe my own sister would humiliate our family like this. She knew how much that trip meant to me. Her voice trembled just enough to sound real. At home in Newton, I could imagine my father watching that video, face hardening. In his study, Robert Henderson slammed his hand against the mahogany desk. "This is all her fault. Claire did this. She's trying to destroy me." Across the room, Evelyn Price, his campaign communications director, looked exhausted. "Robert, we can't control social media. The story's spreading faster than we can manage." "Then fix it," he snapped. "Do your job." Evelyn's tone was even professional. "You don't pay me to erase the truth." That night, an anonymous Reddit account posted screenshots of the Blue Horizon invoice. The caption read, "Confirmed." The payment was canceled after a fraud report. Note the authorization signature. The image zoomed in on the bottom of the document. Authorized by Robert Henderson. The ink was bold, unmistakable. By morning, local outlets had picked it up. The Boston Herald ran the headline, "City Council Candidate Accused of Family Financial Fraud." I found out at 9 a.m. when my phone started vibrating nonstop. I didn't pick up. Instead, I scrolled through the article, reading every word in detached disbelief. They had everything. The canceled invoice, the travel company's statement, even a quote from a source close to the family who said Robert had taken care of things quietly. I could almost hear his voice in that line. When my phone finally stopped buzzing, it rang again. My mother this time. I let it go to voicemail. Then it rang again. Again. I picked up on the fourth try. "Mom, Claire." Her voice was high, frantic. "You have to fix this. The reporters are calling the house. Your father's losing his mind. I'm sure he is. Can't you just say something? Tell them this was all a misunderstanding." I almost laughed. "It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud. Please don't use that word," she cried. "You're making this worse. You don't understand what this will do to him." I stared out the window. The morning sun gleamed off the Charles River, blinding and cold. "I think I understand exactly what it's doing to him." She started to cry quietly, the way she always did when words didn't work. "You're going to ruin us, Claire." I closed my eyes. "No, Mom. You ruined yourselves." When I hung up, the apartment felt too quiet. I turned on the TV, and there he was. My father standing behind a podium at a hastily arranged press conference. Cameras flashed, microphones clustered in front of him. He looked composed, even charming. "This was a simple technical error," he said smoothly. "A banking mix-up that's already been resolved. My daughter is an exceptional woman, and I'm proud of her. We're a close family, and we'll handle this privately." The crowd erupted with questions. "Did you forge her signature? Was this part of your campaign funding? Is your daughter cooperating with investigators?" He smiled through it all. "It's a family matter, and family matters stay in the family." I muted the TV. For a long moment, I sat there staring at his frozen image on the screen. The confident smile, the calm posture, the polished mask that had fooled everyone for years. But I knew that face. I'd seen the version of it that cracked in anger, that twisted in control. My laptop chimed with another email. From Natalie. The fraud report's been accepted. The investigation is official. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sound of the city filter in. Car horns, sirens, the distant wail of an ambulance cutting through morning traffic. He'd spent a lifetime controlling the story. But now, for the first time, it wasn't his to tell. And as much as I hated the attention, I couldn't stop the smallest flicker of satisfaction from blooming in my chest. The truth had finally found its way out. Uninvited, unfiltered, unstoppable. I turned off the TV. The apartment fell silent again. The glow of the screen faded, leaving only my reflection staring back at me. Tired, yes, but steady. I didn't need to defend myself anymore. The facts were already doing that for me. The city outside buzzed with noise, the light of afternoon stretching long across the glass. Somewhere across town, auroras were flashing, statements were being drafted, reputations were unraveling, and I didn't have to say a word. Because the truth, once freed, doesn't need anyone's permission to speak. It was speaking now, louder, clearer, and far more convincingly than I ever could. The Henderson house was silent except for the faint clicking of cameras outside. Reporters had been camped at the edge of the driveway since dawn, their breath visible in the cold air. The blinds were drawn, but flashes still leaked through, turning the dining room into a flickering theater of shame. Inside, my father stood by the window, jaw-tight, phone pressed to his ear. "I lost 2 donors before breakfast," he hissed. 2. Do you know what that does to optics, Greg? His political advisor on the other end tried to calm him. "We can control the narrative, Robert. Give it 48 hours. Issue a revised statement." "There is no narrative," my father snapped. "There's a witch hunt." He threw the phone onto the couch, the sound sharp against the silence. Upstairs, Emily was crying. Her voice drifted faintly through the house, followed by the unmistakable cadence of a live stream. I could almost hear her words through the TV later that afternoon. She sat in her bedroom, makeup-smudged voice trembling just enough to be believable. "I just wanted a happy honeymoon. I didn't ask for any of this. My sister, I don't know why she's doing this to us." Thousands of comments poured in, the kind of sympathy that feeds on ignorance. "Poor girl. That's heartbreaking. Her sister sounds jealous." Downstairs, Linda stood near the kitchen island, her posture weary. "Robert," she said softly, "maybe you should tell the truth. Admit what happened before this gets worse." He turned on her, eyes blazing. "I'm not losing to my own daughter. It's not a competition," she said, voice shaking. "It's reality, reality," he repeated bitterly. "Reality is perception, and I control perception. Always have." She looked at him for a long moment, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. Not anymore. Across town, in a quiet office on Beacon Hill, Natalie slid a thick envelope across a desk toward Detective Harris. The man looked to be in his 50s, calm and meticulous. He opened the folder, eyes scanning the documents. The Blue Horizon invoice, the forged signature comparisons, the bank correspondence. "Looks clean," he said finally. "The fraud's traceable. You did half my work for me." Natalie crossed her legs. "I like things airtight." He nodded, flipping through the last few pages. "We'll process this as a financial fraud case. Given his public position, it'll fall under white-collar jurisdiction. I assume Ms. Henderson understands this could affect the campaign?" "She understands everything," Natalie replied. That evening, I sat on my couch TV, remote in hand, watching the fallout unfold like someone else's tragedy. The local news played clips from my father's latest interview. He looked composed again, wearing that same gray suit and easy confidence that had fooled everyone for years. "This is nothing more than a misunderstanding," he told the reporter. "My daughter and I are close. We'll clear this up privately." The anchor's voiceover followed sources confirm an active investigation into potential financial misconduct by city council candidate Robert Henderson. Henderson has denied all allegations. I muted the TV and stared at the reflection on the black screen, my face pale, my eyes hollow. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like watching something precious die slowly and knowing you couldn't stop it. I leaned back on the couch, rubbing my temples. For years, I'd dreamed of independence, of breaking free from my father's control. I'd imagined it would feel liberating, like breathing after being underwater too long. but all I felt now was emptiness. The phone rang. Natalie's name flashed on the screen. "Hey," I said, my voice flat. "I just spoke to Harris," she said. "It's moving faster than expected. They'll likely issue a preliminary inquiry notice within a week, okay?" A pause. Then softer. "Your mother called me. That caught my attention. She..." "What?" "She reached out this morning," Natalie continued. "Said she wants to cooperate. She's willing to provide a statement confirming your father forged the signature." I sat up, gripping the phone tighter. "You believe her?" "I believe she's scared," Natalie said. "But scared people can be useful if they're finally willing to talk." I didn't respond. The rain had started again outside, tapping softly against the window. "Claire," Natalie said gently, "this could make the difference. But it's your call whether we bring her in." I swallowed hard. "I'll think about it." After we hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. My mother's face flashed through my mind. The quiet resignation, the trembling hands, the way she'd defended him, even when she knew the truth. Could I really trust her now? Or was this just another attempt to control the damage? The screen of my phone lit up again. A text message. "Emily, you won." 2 words, nothing more. Then another message followed. "Are you happy now?" I stared at them until the letters blurred. I could still picture her face when we were kids, the way she used to cling to me, when thunder scared her, the way I'd promise I'd always protect her. Somewhere along the way, that promise had broken, though I wasn't sure who had shattered it first. I deleted the texts without replying. The TV flickered again, switching to a live segment outside my parents' house. Reporters clustered near the gates, shouting questions, their cameras catching flashes of the front door slamming shut. I muted the sound. The truth was out. The investigation was real. The damage was spreading. And yet, sitting there alone in the soft glow of the city, I couldn't help but wonder if there were any winners left in this story. Because no matter how much I told myself otherwise, victory didn't feel like freedom. It felt like loss. Quiet, heavy, irreversible. The rain kept falling, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and gray. I whispered into the silence. "No one wins in a family that's already lost itself." The words lingered in the air, fragile but true. And somewhere beyond the rain, thunder rumbled. Not far off this time, but close, like an echo of everything still waiting to break. The air along the Charles River carried that kind of sharp cold that seeped through even the thickest coat. The morning fog hung low, softening the outlines of the city. I sat near the window of the cafe, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, gone lukewarm, watching the mist curl over the water like breath. When my mother walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. The woman in the gray coat looked older than I remembered. Shoulders hunched, eyes tired, hair unbrushed beneath a wool hat. She held a small manila envelope in both hands, as if it were something fragile. "Claire," she said softly, stopping just short of the table. I gestured to the empty chair across from me. "Sit." She did, carefully, as though the chair might give way beneath her. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence between us had weight. Finally, she exhaled. "Your father forced me to sign it." I said nothing. Her hands trembled around the envelope. "He told me if I didn't, he'd leave. After everything. His campaign, the house, Emily's wedding. He said I was ungrateful. That I was choosing you over him." Her voice cracked, and I was terrified. I thought if he walked out, everything would fall apart. Everything did. I said quietly. She winced but didn't look away. "I know." She slid the envelope across the table. "That's the statement for Natalie. I already filled it out. I wanted to give it to you directly." I opened it, scanning the document. It was short, factual, signed in her neat, familiar handwriting. A single page, but it was enough to confirm everything. My father had used my name, my signature, my account, and my mother had known. "I didn't stop him," she whispered. "I wanted to, but I froze. I thought I could protect both of you. Instead, I protected no one." For a long moment, I couldn't find words. There was anger somewhere inside me, but it felt too far away to reach. What I felt now was emptiness, like I'd already burned through every emotion I had left. "I'm not angry," I said finally. "I just don't know who you are anymore." She looked down at her hands. "I don't either." We sat there listening to the quiet hum of the cafe. The hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of a couple ordering lattes. Life kept moving around us as if nothing monumental was happening. "I know it's too late to ask forgiveness," she said, voice small. "But I need you to understand. Your father has always been larger than life. He decides what's right, and the rest of us learn to live around his decisions." I told myself that was strength, but really it was fear. Her eyes met mine, watery but steady. "You asked me once what I was most afraid of. I think I told you something meaningless like losing the house or the family falling apart. But that wasn't the truth. What was I asked? Being seen," she said, "by anyone, especially by you." The words landed like a stone in my chest. Now she continued, "Everyone can see what we've done. What I've done. Maybe that's what I deserve." I reached for the statement again, turning it over in my hands. "This will help," I said. "I hope so. You could have helped me sooner." Her eyes dropped to the table. "I wasn't brave then." "You are now," I said, surprising myself. She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time that morning she smiled. Small, uncertain, but real. "That's generous of you." "It's not generosity," I said. "It's the truth. You could still change things even if it's late." I pulled a pen from my bag and slid the statement back toward her. "Natalie will need your signature in front of a notary. We can go together if you want." She hesitated, then took the pen. Her hand shook as she signed her name, each stroke deliberate and trembling. When she was done, she set the pen down and pressed her fingers to her temples, as if the effort had drained her. A single tear slid down her cheek, landing on the paper. She didn't wipe it away. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think about what happens after this?" "All the time." And I looked out the window at the river. I don't know. Maybe we stop pretending we're a family. Maybe that's how something honest finally starts. She followed my gaze, her expression unreadable. "You sound like your grandfather," she said softly. "He used to say the same thing about your father, that pretending would destroy him before the truth ever did." There was a long silence. Outside, a jogger passed by, breath visible in the air. The river moved slow under the pale light. My mother stood adjusting her coat. She looked at me, then at the document on the table, now sealed inside a new envelope. "You'll give it to Natalie, I will." She nodded. Then, before turning to leave, she said, "You were right, you know." "About what?" "When you said I was more afraid of losing him than losing you." Her eyes glistened. "You were right then, but not anymore." I didn't respond. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the door. The bell above it chimed softly. As she opened it, a burst of cold air rushing in from the street. She turned back one last time. "You always asked me what I feared most," she said. "It's this, being seen for who I really am. And now," she gave a faint, broken smile, "now everyone sees." Then she was gone. I sat there staring at the empty chair across from me, the faint impression of her coffee cup still on the table. Outside, the fog was thinning, the river beginning to glimmer beneath the weak sunlight. I picked up the envelope, running my fingers along the seal, and whispered to myself, "Some apologies come too late." But as I watched her figure grow smaller through the mist, I realized late didn't always mean useless. Sometimes it just meant the chapter was finally closing. A month later, the headlines had already replaced his face with someone else's. Scandal moved fast in Boston. People only lingered on what embarrassed them long enough to forget it. Still, every morning, I saw his name somewhere, at the bottom of a news crawl in a passing headline, like the echo of a storm already blown out to sea. Robert Henderson withdraws from city council race amid fraud allegations. The accompanying photo showed him outside the courthouse, jaw set, coat collar turned up against the wind. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in stature but in presence. The man who once filled every room he walked into now looked swallowed by daylight. In the weeks since the investigation began, donations had evaporated. His campaign office, once bustling with volunteers and cameras, now stood half empty. Reporters lingered outside the community building where he'd announced his bid for election. "The Fall of a Family Man," one headline read. Michael Chen from the Globe published an article titled, "From Model Family to $58,000 Scandal." When reputation is built on lies. His words were sharp but fair. Reading them, I felt something between vindication and pity. At my desk, sunlight stretched across the floor in long amber lines. My coffee had gone cold again, but I didn't bother warming it. I sat with the newspaper open, staring at the photo of my father in mid-stride, hand raised as if pushing away the truth. My phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. I looked at the screen, Dad. For a moment I considered letting it ring. Then I answered. Claire. His voice was rougher than I remembered, low and tired. Dad. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear him breathing. When he finally spoke, the anger I expected wasn't there. You've destroyed everything, he said almost softly. I closed my eyes. No, I canceled a transaction. The words hung between us, simple and unarguable. Another silence followed, heavier this time. Then he said, You think you understand what I've sacrificed for this family? What I've given up for you, for your mother, for Emily. I understand, I said quietly. I just don't call it sacrifice. He let out a harsh breath. Not quite a laugh, more like disbelief. You sound just like your grandfather. I'll take that as a compliment. Don't, he snapped, the old authority creeping back in. That man ruined me. Always criticizing, always saying I valued image over integrity. I built something lasting, something respected. Respected, I echoed. Until now. He didn't answer. For a few seconds all I could hear was static and his unsteady breathing. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to a whisper. You'll regret this, Claire. You think you've won, but all you've done is tear this family apart. The calm in my chest surprised me. It was already broken, Dad. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. He went quiet again. I imagined him standing in his study. The same study where I used to do my homework, where he'd sit behind that grand oak desk like a judge in his own court. I pictured the walls lined with awards, framed photos, polished certificates. All the proof that he was a man worth admiring. Maybe he was looking at them now, wondering which moment had undone it all. Goodbye, Dad, I said finally. You think silence will protect you, he said, his voice rising. You think people won't judge you for what you've done. I don't care what they think, I said. I stopped living for other people's approval the day you decided mine didn't matter. I hung up before he could respond. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was full, expansive, the kind of silence that hums with something alive beneath it. I sat there for a moment, staring out at the city skyline. The afternoon sun had turned everything gold, even the old brick buildings that lined the street below. I walked to the window, pushing it open just enough to let in the crisp autumn air. Leaves swirled in lazy spirals, yellow and red against the gray concrete. Somewhere in the distance I could hear the faint toll of church bells. Boston in fall had always been my favorite, a season that felt both ending and beginning at once. I rested my hands on the windowsill. My father's voice still echoed faintly in my head, the same rhythm of control he'd used my whole life. For years, silence had been his greatest weapon. It was how he manipulated, how he punished, how he made everyone bend to his will, through what he didn't say. But now, silence was mine. I didn't owe him words, explanations, or apologies. I didn't owe anyone anything. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and faint traces of coffee from the cafe across the street. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the city fill me. Footsteps, laughter, car horns. A chorus of ordinary life continuing on. The quiet inside me wasn't fear anymore. It was peace. He used to believe that control was strength, that power came from making others small. But standing there, surrounded by nothing but the soft murmur of autumn, I realized he'd never really known strength at all. Because real strength isn't in silencing others. It's in refusing to be silenced. The leaves rustled against the window frame, a whisper against the glass. I let out a long breath I didn't know I'd been holding. For years, his silence had defined me. Today, it set me free. 1 year later, the city felt different. Or maybe it was just me. Boston's skyline glowed under the early evening sun, and the tall windows of the Scholarship Foundation's hall reflected light like liquid gold. Inside, laughter and the low hum of jazz floated through the air. I stood near the refreshment table, a glass of white wine in my hand, watching people drift between conversations. It was the annual gala for the Henderson Foundation, though my father's name was nowhere on the banner anymore. I had taken over the management after the investigation closed and renamed it simply the Horizon Fund because it felt cleaner that way. A fresh start, a view forward. Natalie was across the room, chatting animatedly with Michael Chen, the journalist who'd written the piece that had broken the story wide open. It was strange to see them laughing together now. Two people who had once only been connected by the wreckage of my family's secrets. When they spotted me, Natalie waved me over. Claire. "You're avoiding the photographer again," she said mock stern. "I was just giving other people their moment," I replied, smiling. "Your turn," Michael said, gesturing toward the backdrop where the event photographer waited camera in hand. "You're the reason we're all here tonight. Don't pretend otherwise." I walked toward the small stage, smoothing my blue dress. Darker than sapphire, lighter than navy. It wasn't something I would have worn a year ago. Too bright, too visible. But tonight visibility didn't scare me. Natalie joined me on one side, Michael on the other, and a few of our colleagues crowded in around us. The photographer raised his camera. "All right, everyone." Big smiles. The flash went off bright and quick, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I actually smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile that said I was fine when I wasn't, but something real, something light. The photographer lowered his camera. "Perfect. That one's going on the website." I laughed, shaking my head. God help us all. As the crowd began to disperse, Natalie leaned in. "How do you feel?" I glanced at the stage, the people, the lights spilling through the tall windows. Like I finally stopped waiting for someone else to see me. She nodded. "That's the thing about truth. Once it's out, it changes the air. You breathe easier." Later, as the music softened and people started to leave, I found myself standing near the window watching the last streaks of daylight fade over the river. My reflection looked back at me. Calmer, older maybe, but whole. My father hadn't spoken to me since that last phone call. His campaign never recovered. He'd withdrawn from public life entirely. I heard from Natalie that he'd moved out of Boston somewhere quieter, where no one asked questions. My mother still lived in the house in Newton, though she called less often now. The distance between us had turned from anger into something gentler. A mutual acceptance that some things couldn't be fixed. My phone buzzed in my purse. A new message from Mom. I saw the article about the foundation. "I'm proud of you." I stared at it for a long time, then hit save instead of reply. When the hall finally emptied, I stayed behind to help the staff pack up the last of the decorations. The photographer handed me a printed copy of our group photo. "You looked good in this one," he said with a grin. "Thank you," I said, taking it carefully. Back at my apartment, I hung the photo on the wall above my desk. The light from the street lamps poured in through the window, soft and golden, catching the edges of the frame. In it, I stood between friends, laughing open, unguarded. The first photo of my life that didn't feel like a performance. I stepped back and looked at it for a long moment, remembering the words my father had thrown at me years ago. "You'll ruin the picture, Claire." Maybe he was right. I had ruined it. But not in the way he meant. I'd torn apart the illusion of perfection, the glossy lie we'd all posed inside. I'd destroyed that picture so I could make a new one. A real one. The city outside was quiet now. I walked to the window, opened it just enough to feel the night air brush against my skin. Somewhere below, someone laughed. Somewhere, a car radio played faintly. Life went on. Imperfect, unpredictable, alive. I took one last seek of the leftover wine and turned back to the photo, smiling. He said I'd ruin the image, but all I'd really done was erase what wasn't true. And as I stood there, the city lights flickering against the glass, a thought settled gently in my chest. Not anger, not regret, just peace. If you've ever been cut out of the picture, if they told you that you didn't belong in the story they wanted to tell, remember this. You can always take another one. You can always start again.